Hey, Sub here. Wanted to kind of dive into a topic that's really interesting to me. And I think it's misunderstood or not understood at all by most, people who just play games who've never done development of any type. And that is kind of like what is a development cycle? What does it look like? And why why is the timing important? Um, and so specifically in relation to Warzone and how Warzone can be completely uh seem completely off base and kind of have really messed up launches integrations when the multiplayer game actually went really well. So I mean, right now we're in the middle of Treyarch, the Black Ops 6 integration, and Black Ops 6 launched very well. It was well loved. People really enjoyed the game. It was one of the most popular, highly, most played games, in the Modern Warfare 2 Warzone 2.0 era. Um, and definitely had a lot of acclaim and set the bar very high for Warzone. And so when this Warzone integration launched, it's been a bit of a disaster, to be honest. And so there's a lot of talk going around about why that is and what's happening. But I think it's important to sit back and kind of look at the development cycle from an over like understand the development cycle kind of from a higher level so that what happened here with Black Ops 6 actually makes more sense and why we had a lot of problems and not just technical issues but like quality of life reversions, right? We have changes to the movement that are considered negative by a lot of the community. We have perk adjustments such as losing overkill as a standard perk, and losing the ability to reload and run that we had last year with Modern Warfare 3. And I think um it's due to how the Modern Warfare 2 era development goes, right? In Modern Warfare 1, for example, everything Warzone related was based off of MW 2019, which meant they couldn't innovate very much at a fundamental level. It was mostly new guns, new trinkets, and a new map every year. But the core mechanics were tied directly to 2019, so they never changed, right? And so we saw that with Vanguard. When Vanguard launched, there were a lot of mechanics that were introduced and changed. Destructible doors. There were movement changes and how the game played was radically felt very different than Warzone at the time because it was designed to be different than 2019. But the result of that was that Warzone 1 felt um, very consistent across its entire life cycle, right? Didn't matter what area you were in, the movement felt the same, the gameplay felt the same, right? You could run and plate, you could do all these things that never changed. They never changed the core mechanics of it. But when you look at the Modern Warfare 2 Warzone 2 era, we've had now three integrations, and the game has fundamentally changed every time, right? It fundamentally changed from Warzone 1 to Warzone 2. It fundamentally changed from Warzone 2 to Warzone 3, Modern Warfare 3. And now with Black Ops, it's changed again. And in this case, it's actually reverted a lot of things that Modern Warfare 2 did that were actually really good. And it brought some problems in that we thought we'd gotten rid of. So I want to just kind of overview it and spurned by this tweet by the WRZ on Twitter, which I'll put up on the screen here so you can see. And he made this oversimplified graphic to explain why the Warzone dev cycle is difficult for Raven, who is now the primary Warzone developer. Okay, and he does this as an argument for why Warzone should actually be on its own engine and have its own systems its own development team, which I actually don't disagree with. I think that's a really good. I think that'll be good for Warzone to get the consistency back, year to year to year, because I think what we've learned is that the game doesn't do good. It's not perceived well when core mechanics kind of yo-yo back and forth, right? Like one year we get plating and running, and the next year that's a perk. One year we can slide and shoot, and the next year that's a perk, right? One year we have aim sway, and the next year we get rid of it, and then we bring it back, right? We need to get rid of that feeling. And I think part of that is to make Warzone kind of have a more more of an intentional design in its feel that is a bit apart from the rest of the games, the multiplayer games that come out, and just pulls in the good additional parts. And so part of the problem that we have with the way Warzone is going is kind of shown by this graph where um, Treyarch, for example, will spend time developing uh, developing features for the game, for their multiplayer game. And then when you get to the point where, late in the cycle, about, according to this graph, it's about a year, that features developed for multiplayer get adapted for Warzone by Raven and implemented right prior to their integration. And so there's this idea, I think, that floats around that, these development studios are like sitting together working on these products, and that together they design it and ship it and get it ready to send out. The reality is that software development tends to be a lot more siloed than I think most people realize. In that teams don't do a lot of cross interaction unless they need to, right? So if you're working on a feature, you tend to be on your feature working on it until it's ready to be integrated with the rest of the system, and then it kind of gets moved into a test environment and you start seeing what broke. And so there's a software program called GitHub is the most popular. There's a variety of other ones that basically what they do, and this is my very unattractive graph showing it, is they replicate the main environment for you, so that you can work on stuff on your own, right, without being interfered with by anybody else. So if you look at this, right, production at the top level, production is the live game, right? That's what we play. And then below production is kind of like the main test environment. So that's where everything comes together and has is all tested together, and that's where all the different ideas and new features are integrated with one another. Then what they do is they make a copy of the test environment, and they make a copy. They'll make copies for all the different groups that are working on features for the game. You have a networking or architecture, core infrastructure group, level design, character design, user experience, user interface, sound will have its own, animations, right? Like all of these groups are going to have their own environments. Okay, they're going to have their own test silos that aren't impacted by anybody else. Because if I'm working on a UI, right, for example, and somebody else is working on creating animations, if I make a change to the UI that interferes with an animation that somebody's doing, right, or maybe that's not the clearest example. If I'm a level designer and I'm creating a new type of table for a room, right, and that table might interfere with I want to make it destructible, for example. That table could interfere with the animation guys who are making executions or a rolling move or some kind of character movement, right? And so if we're both changing code at the same time, right, then I'm going to create something for the table, and then the character animator is going to come up with what happens if I run into a table. Like, does my roll stop? Do I do I fall over? Like, what happens when I run into a table? But now you have this new table that I don't know anything about that is destructible. So I run into it, it destructs, and it reacts poorly to my character. And it's very difficult to develop in these situations where you're changing one thing, I'm changing another, and they conflict with each other. So what they do is they go and they actually will clone the main game, and they will clone it dozens and dozens and dozens of times, and everybody gets their own copy of it. And so if you have in the networking, in this networking sector, right, you might have 6 different people working on different networking things, and they all have their own copy of it, right? And then what happens is when a change happens at the main level, that change will get pushed down and update every single one of these with what changed. And so the goal with that is I'm going to, is that everybody's working up to date, right? Everybody knows how the game works, so they can build their animations or their destructible environments or whatever they're working on with what everybody else is doing in mind. The problem is that's a very complicated system. And so it's very hard for all of these little silos of people, all these developers, right, that are all working on their own individual version of the game to keep up with it and to make sure that everything they do works. And so what happens is that's why, you know, these sort of tests happen in stages, right? And so when they develop a new feature, right, it gets, you know, they test it on their environment, then they update the environment, make sure it works with everything else. Then they kind of will move it up the, you know, up the line and eventually test it on the main test, and then everybody gets the change as long as it's approved. And then it'll go live and we'll see it. When game developers are making games like Warzone and Call of Duty, they're living in their own test environments. They're not working with each other directly. And it's pretty clear from what we've seen in the last few years that there's not a lot of there's not a lot that gets pushed up for Raven to see until it's time to integrate it to the main test. Okay, so if you look at this idea of game design in these you know, so in these silos that people work in, right? If Raven is over here working on one set of features and Infinity Ward's in the middle working on another set of features, and you have Treyarch working on another set of features, right? They don't get integrated with each other until it's time for them to push their stuff up for Raven to pull in to Warzone. And the problem is there's no cross communication. They don't work with each other to develop features for Warzone. They develop their own features for their own game, and then they push them up, you know, when they're ready. It's creating too many problems, not just bugs, not just glitches, but basic features that we get used to as players that we want to see continue get wiped away because they're not part of the vision that you know, that Treyarch, for example, came up with 3 years ago, or Infinity Ward came up with, you know, is coming up with now for a game a year from now. All right, you know, Sledgehammer is supposed to have a game in 3 years, right? 2027, I think, is their game, and they're looking at what's going on right now, and they're going to make decisions today, right now, for how the game is going to play in 3 years. But for all we know, Infinity Ward is going to come up with some great new feature. Maybe could happen. Some great new feature that changes everything. And then we are like, we want that feature. And then Sledgehammer's not going to have it. Their game won't have it. Right. So we got to get away from that. That's what's kind of going on here with the development and how this development system works is we're really siloed these studios from each other. They're not communicating. They're not sharing what they're working on back and forth. And they're definitely not sharing it with Raven until they're ready for Raven to start putting it into the game. And so when that happens, we end up with we lose features we like. We get introduced to features we don't want. And it creates a completely disjointed gaming experience that's just generally not a good one for everybody, especially compared to Warzone 2, which was a very good, consistent experience from the user standpoint. Bugs and cheaters aside, it was a very consistent experience for 3 years. And we haven't had it since, and we got to get back to it. That's what I got. If you got any questions or comments, drop them in the description below or in the comments below, and I'm going to catch you on the next one.